what compelled you to go to St. Michael's on Ware just on your own?
I think it's such a fascinating and complicated story, isn't it? And I think it's the coming together of quite a lot of the stories of our times, really, which are, which is about, community and sense of purpose and tech and the way that the tools of mass communication like TikTok and YouTube are influencing our behaviour, and content creation and the industry around that, and what drives people, what motivates people to the extremes of, rummaging through bushes in people's gardens at the scene of a disappearance. I think that was the big question that I wanted to answer. And we'll come on to some of the complexities of that in a moment. But I think it's very, it's easy and in lots of ways fair to describe that as being more unhelpful than helpful, and a nuisance, and unhelpful, very unhelpful behaviour, in some ways harassing behaviour. I think my big question was less, what's going on, and more, why is this happening?
Mm. And so what was the mood like when you arrived there? I think you told me that you arrived there on a Tuesday. I mean, what was the atmosphere like in this small village that's obviously been really struck by this?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I've never been to St. Michael's on Wye before, so I don't have anything to compare, I suppose. But it certainly felt a little bit eerie. It felt uncertain. I think there was definitely, it's, you can interpret things differently, can't you? And but it certainly felt like there was something a little bit heavy in the air. I didn't speak to very many locals, so I didn't really get the sort of the chance. Really, well, actually, there was one local who approached me who didn't want to be recorded, but he was talking about. He sort of lived nearby, and he was saying, like, why are all the cameras looking at the river? He couldn't quite understand what was going on, I don't think. And I think that he was kind of he was grappling with the fact that this place, this part of the world that was clearly important to him and was very familiar to him, suddenly felt quite unfamiliar, and was all over the news, and there were loads of cameras and journalists and passers-by and people like me who were coming to, who were on the scene. So I think for a lot of people in the village, it felt quite unsettling, I think.
So before we touch on the TikTok aspect of it, you said that there were some just general members of the public that came to take a look, some of whom weren't residents there. I mean, why were they attending?
Yeah, so when I first arrived at the scene, I went to one of the journalists there who were sort of huddled together in a pack. There's a big bank of cameras and microphones and print journalists who were watching the search operation. And I went to one of them and I said, I'm not here to cover the case. I'm here to talk about the vigilantes and the people who've come to rummage in bushes and make TikTok content. Have you seen any of these types of people? And he pointed over in the direction of a group of young girls, and he said, you want to talk to those people over there, the grief junkies, he said. So I went over to this group of women, young women, really, with bobble hats and Costa coffee mugs, and I approached them and I said, what's compelled you to want to come here? And they were pretty open and honest about the fact that this was something that they were really struggling with, that they couldn't understand what had happened. They were mothers and daughters themselves, and they got children. And she said, you said, why wouldn't you want to come and help and offer an extra pair of eyes? And I put that accusation to them that they were grief junkies. I said, what would you say to those people who say that you are here to have a look and that you are a grief junkie? And one of them said to me, well, what are you doing? Are all of those people up there pointing at the bank of cameras and microphones and journalists? They're all grief junkies as well, right? We're only doing what you're doing. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And I think it is clearly different in many ways. There's a difference between trained journalists who have editors and who are governed by regulators and who have a job to do, which is to document something in the public interest, document a public interest story in the public interest, and those people who go just because they want to have a look. However, I think you'd be hard-pressed to deny that there is perhaps a grief junkie in all of us to some capacity. Because there was one other guy that I spoke to as well. Who, when I asked him what his motivations were for coming down, he described that he'd lost his grandchildren, 4 of his grandchildren, in a house fire. And I have to say, this guy really stopped me in my tracks. And he talked about the grief, the very real grief that he had faced and experienced, and that he'd come because he wanted to see the family. He wanted to try to find Nicola's family and express some sympathy and some solidarity with them as somebody who's also experienced grief. And to be honest with you, I put the point to him about grief junkies, and I felt a wave of guilt for even questioning why he would be there, when it was very clear that his own grief had drawn him to the scene of somebody else's. And you know, and I think that we can be very quick to judge the types of people who come to these places where you know, actually there are a whole host of different complex, complicated reasons that compel somebody to the scene of a disappearance.
Yeah, I mean, I found that really compelling about the piece was that just again, like people who had experienced these tragedies, and you get into later, and we'll touch on it later, how one of the TikTok sleuths, I guess you could call him, it actually becomes uncovered that he was a victim of it, or his sister had died of a tragedy. And so it's kind of all of these grief-stricken people who, and he didn't really receive any answers, and some of these people just had no answers for their own grief. And so they come to try and kind of resolve some of that, like resolve those questions. Yeah, it's worth, I guess, like a psychological analysis. Um, but what have these TikTok sleuths been doing when they've come to Nicola Bulley's village?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 types of people that I think we should be definitely clear about this. Is that there are the so-called grief junkies, of which, you know, clearly the guy that really challenged my assumption of that wasn't one of them. And the women who the journalist described as that, you know, they had the interesting point to make about the fact that, you know, aren't we all, how different is that you know, the press and the other people that are coming down. You know, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is the TikTok sleuths, the people who have come with the express intention of trying to actively search for Nicola, but also create content around that as well, and create videos. And one of the most prolific TikTokers of the Nicola Bulley case is a guy called Duffy, who I met. And I spent quite a bit of time with Dan as he kind of taught me through what he'd been doing. He'd been rummaging through bushes and been in people's gardens, and had been up to a house just opposite the river that he assumed to be abandoned, and had made videos about this case that had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. He himself has about 100,000 followers on TikTok. He has 200,000 followers on YouTube. And, you know, he kind of, I just got a bit of a sense of the scale of the industry around this story, right? And around the kind of true crime TikTok, the true crime genre on TikTok. The true crime community on TikTok is probably a better way of describing it, who share theories and share conspiracies often, some of them incredibly unhelpful, some of them clearly very distressing. And then there are people who feel compelled to come to the scene of the crime. So obviously, the scene of the disappearance. So obviously, you know, these people have been widely condemned. The police have said that it's distressing for the family, it's unhelpful for the case, to stop doing it. I put that to Dan, and he said that he feels that he is being genuinely helpful, that, you know, he could find something. He pointed to a case where he'd found a skull once whilst making a YouTube video, a human skull. I don't think there was anything resolved, and it was several hundred years old, I think, in the end. But you know, but he thinks that, and you know, he defended himself, and he also made the point that the other women made, that, you know, aren't the journalists doing the same thing? And, you know, I explained the differences to him, I think, in that case. But I was obviously very compelled to try to find out why. What is it that's compelling somebody to the scene of a disappearance like this? And he told me that he had a family tragedy himself, that his sister had died in 2011, that they had recorded an open verdict, and that he felt that he didn't have closure in that part of his life, and that perhaps he wanted to bring a bit of closure for another family that he was never afforded himself. And that really struck me. He also talked a little bit about feeling like he wanted to be the hero. He said, I really want to be the hero. I want to be the superhero. I want to be a real-life superhero, the person who finds Nicola. And that he's struggled with a sense of belonging, that he wants to belong to something. He wants to be part of a community, and that he's felt like a number and a lost sheep for a long time. And I think that really spoke to, you know, this issue that I think is at the heart of this story, which is real shifts in community, real shifts in society, particularly post-pandemic, but these have been happening for a while, accelerated by technology and the fracturing of society and the way that we are kind of retreating to our own silos, and that's happening through predominantly really through our use of technology and the way that work has changed and the way that we socialise has changed, and then all of those things being massively accelerated by the pandemic, right? And I think he represents a very real and quite sizable proportion of people who feel like they are struggling for a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging. And I think clearly for him and for many others, that's manifested itself in this quite damaging practice of TikTok sleuthing. But I think that's worth us understanding, and I think that's worth us considering. And you know, I got quite a bit of criticism. Well, I got some criticism. I won't overplay it, but quite, you know, plenty of praise as well. But there was some criticism. Some people suggesting that I was part of the problem, that these people are simply seeking attention, and that I'm giving them attention, that I'm feeding their cravings in a way that is unhelpful. And I would refute that. I think that we have to understand what does motivate somebody to this kind of behaviour. I think we also have to talk to each other and do a better job of understanding each other. I think that the way that we kind of dismiss each other is a big part of the problem. It's a big part of what leads people to the extremes of behaviour like this, right? Is that people feel like they're being dismissed. People feel like they aren't being heard and being listened to. That's different to hearing them out on the conspiracies that they're sharing or hearing them out on their damaging theories. That's not what I'm talking about here. But I'm talking about us understanding what motivates people to get to that position. And I think that we could all be a bit more compassionate and open-minded and understanding of that. And I think that we would all be better off for it.
I do. I mean, this part of it, like this part of these onlookers, these people that kind of, I mean, his motivations obviously are very, very complex, but I think in some ways he, and I think one of the other sleuths that you spoke with, are kind of, in some ways, chasing fame and notoriety through this case. And it's almost kind of dystopian when you really think about it for too long. But I wonder whether it adds into this wider context that we're seeing. There's a huge debate going on in the UK right now about violence against women. Obviously, there was also the case of the mother and head teacher that was killed in Epsom in her home by her husband, we believe. There's been arguments about the Metropolitan Police and David Carrick, and it's been a wide discussion happening for years now. And here we have these TikTok vigilantes who, I mean, I don't know if he was profiting monetarily from these videos. We don't know that, but profiting in notoriety and clout, and kind of creating a name for himself off of her tragedy, off of her story that unfortunately she wasn't able to tell. And I just wonder whether if that, whatever his motivations might be, whether it's quite damaging in that sense. If that makes sense.
It's definitely damaging. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that, and I say that in the piece, that I think that, I think that there are two things that are true here. What Dan does is hurtful and harmful. The police have said so. He kind of, I think he does understand that. I think he does see that, but I do think he genuinely feels like he's motivated by for the right reasons. I do genuinely think that he feels like he wants to try to contribute and help, and that he feels like he is. And then, when you consider all of the other complexities, it's harmful to the family, it's harmful to the police investigation, it's harmful to the villagers. But people are complicated. People are really complex, and there are all sorts of motivating factors around sense of purpose and community. And I think what became quite obvious to me quite quickly is that there is something very human behind it. And I think understanding that can help us. I mean, this is perhaps for other people, not for me, but to help people kind of navigate away from that and to channel that energy into something else, and to understand that our communities are very different these days, and that there are people that feel a bit lost and a bit left behind, and that can manifest itself in ways that are that are harmful.
So, were you able to see we'll touch on a second that he was kind of that he was banned from TikTok
Yeah,
shortly after you initially interviewed him.
yeah.
But were the were the police able to intervene? Like, do they have a process in order to stop these people from interfering in the investigation, or is that kind of an answer that hasn't been come up with yet?
Well, it's a slightly tricky case in that respect because this is obviously a missing persons investigation because there is no evidence. The police have no evidence of third party involvement as it stands as we record this on Sunday evening. They have no evidence of third party involvement, and so therefore they haven't opened a criminal investigation, which kind of limits their powers in terms of how much land they can cordon off, where they can search, what they can do, where their powers extend. And so that's created something of a vacuum, and I guess a bit of an opportunity for people to exploit, really. It also means that the area isn't cordoned off, so you can walk right up to the river bank. I was stood right on the riverbank next to the chair next to the bench that the phone was found, and so the site is an open site for people to go and to make content, I guess, and to film and to search. The police did issue. They were given a warrant. They were given a 48-hour dispersal order, so that the police were able to, for a period of 48 hours, move people on from the area if they felt that they were doing something that was antisocial and harmful, particularly to the local residents and to the villagers. But the police's hands are a little bit tied. You have the right to go there. It's a public place. You have the right to be there. You have the right to film on that place. You have the right to post something to TikTok if you want to. It, of course, becomes more legally tricky when you defame people or you suggest that people are suspects, and that's where Danny ran into some problems that we'll talk about in a moment. But I think it's really exposed that friction between kind of like, between freedom of access, freedom of speech, the freedom to be able to do this sort of thing, and what police powers, how the police can monitor that kind of situation and keep people on the straight and narrow.
So, towards the end of the documentary, you basically find out that actually he's been banned from TikTok. He has breached their community guidelines, he's violated their community guidelines. And then, you phone him and you speak to him on the phone, and he says, he's not going to go back on. He's kind of realized the error in his ways, and he's not going to be uploading that kind of content anymore. He's going to leave it to the authorities. But now we see that has changed.
Yeah, so not long after I spoke to him, a couple of days after, I think it was the night after I'd spoken to him, things took a bit of a turn, and he got himself into a confrontation with somebody. Some people were described as suspects. Dan says that wasn't by him; it was by others. I'm not 100% sure of the truth of that, but he got banned from TikTok, and TikTok said that there were multiple breaches of the guidelines, and that they take harassment and bullying very seriously. And so the TikTok account that he had amassed 100,000 followers on, several 100,000 followers, I think 500,000 views per video of the Nicola Bulley case, huge, astonishing numbers that he'd created this content around, was removed. He has set up another TikTok account where he's moved some of the content that was on the original TikTok account to this new one. That appears to have been what's happened. He's also posted an update in which he said that any other updates are not going to be on this TikTok account, they're going to be on my other social media. And he told me on Friday, when I spoke to him on the phone on Friday morning, that was the morning after he'd been suspended, that he wasn't going to do it anymore. He didn't want to cause any more harm to the villagers. He didn't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable, and that he was going to stop and leave it to the professionals. Today, as of Sunday, there were two new videos where he'd thrown a ball for his dog. I think he was kind of trying to demonstrate one element of the story about the Nicola's dog and how intelligent dogs are. It's not clear to me whether or not he's done that on the scene of the disappearance, or whether he's done that just in some woodland near home. That's not obvious. But he has still continued to post content about the case. But I don't have any evidence that he's been back and that he's been in the village.
Yeah. This, just one last question. There's been a much wider discussion happening kind of around true crime, just as a kind of industry, really. The release of the Jeffrey Dahmer series got, I think, a lot of criticism because people were in some ways glorifying it or romanticizing it. And it was important. I think a lot of people were having to remind each other, like, this is a real case. This is, this is a real crime. These are heinous crimes. And we need to, this isn't just for TikTok. This isn't just for you to kind of make like edits of and for you to talk about. These are real lives that were destroyed. Similar kind of TikTok sleuths were in the United States. They were attempting to uncover the Idaho murders. And again, there's a lot of discourse around kind of reminding people that, again, these are real lives. These are families. You're not a detective. You're just a person on TikTok. And, this is, these are real lives and really heinous crimes. And I think there's a lot of people arguing that turning these horrific murders into entertainment and kind of glorifying it is really, really harmful, and is almost harmful on us as a society in the way that we view these events. I mean, would you say that these TikTok sleuths with Nicola Bulley, do you think it's a bit of a turning point? Do you think people might be kind of like changing the way that they're consuming this content, or do you think that it's making it ever more popular?
I think what we're seeing play out in this kind of true crime TikTok community is the combination of lots of different things. So there are the things that we've talked about already, which are the sort of, the changing community, people looking for a sense of purpose, people being online a lot more, people finding their tribe and their community and all of those really basic human needs in a place like a true crime community. And then, of course, that graduating from the online world into offline, people rummaging through gardens and the really damaging bits of that. That's obviously happening. There is the power of the technology as well, right? How powerful the TikTok algorithms are. How powerful the dopamine rewards are when you get lots of views and likes and comments on your content. I don't think we can underestimate just quite what an influence they are having on the brain, right? and how they are playing, and how they're playing on and pulling on some of the most human instincts that we have, and some of our human faculties. All of those things are happening. And then, of course, there is the cultural influence as well, which is, as you say, the true crime documentaries and the true crime genre, and a boom in the true crime genre. And what the true crime genre very often does, and one of the main criticisms of the true crime genre, is that it applies simple narratives to really complex situations. Crime is messy. Humans are messy. The world is extremely complicated and multifaceted, and there is all sorts going on. And the true crime genre very often applies really simple narratives, hooks and teases, which I'll come on to in a moment, to those stories. And that becomes really, really unhelpful. There are two documentaries that I'd like to reference that I think demonstrate this really well. The first one is called Murder at the Cecil Hotel, which is the story of a young woman who goes missing while she's staying at this sort of notorious hotel in LA that's got this really complicated past and is the scene of lots of crime and murders and stuff. And the way that story is told through this documentary leads you down all sorts of different paths. It creates a sense of mystery and intrigue and jeopardy around this hotel. And this sort of sense that there's a foreboding around this hotel, that there is some sort of curse, that these things continue to happen. It finds patterns in the way that people have gone missing or murders have happened, etc. When in reality, what you also have to understand is that hotel is in a very deprived area of LA. It's full of social issues, crime, deprivation, and things that you would expect to go hand in hand with the sort of outcomes that hotel presents, right? And the other element of that documentary as well is the way that it creates narratives around characters, that it uses the sort of online sleuths piecing together evidence to suggest that the hotel manager might have done it, or this guy who was a musician who released some music with lyrics about death in it and stayed in the hotel the week before, and all of these sorts of things that creates. It literally frames people as being suspects when they are probably not. And that needs to do that because it needs to create jeopardy, it needs to create intrigue, it needs to create narratives, it needs to make you watch from one episode to the next. So at the end of one episode, you can be completely convinced that a certain person did it based on the evidence that you've been presented. And then it's the following episode before they unravel all that evidence and unpick it and explain that actually it couldn't have been that person. Well, that's a really harmful way of telling stories. Really harmful way of telling stories. There's another series as well called Don't F with Cats. I won't use the full title, but that's a series that again explores how online detectives, effectively people with lots of time on their hands, with Facebook accounts, with access to Google Maps, and digging around other information, managed to effectively crack the case of this guy who'd killed some cats and then went on to do some other really bad stuff as well. And they were able to sort of use their time and the resource that they had in the way that the police couldn't. And it could be argued that they actually really helped in that case. And I think there's two conflicting things going on there, isn't there? I think there is, again, all of those kind of complex social issues and social structures, and people having time and access to tech, coupled with the narratives that these true crime series present us. And what you have there is the perfect storm for these things to happen and thrive. I'll say this. I think the main thing that I was trying to demonstrate, and that really struck me, was that several things can be true at once. That these videos and this industry of true crime on TikTok and people following the case of Nicola Bulley especially can be really harmful and can be really distressing, but also that people are complicated and that humans are complex and motivations are really complex as well. And that I think the way that we dismiss each other as being kind of quite simple two-dimensional figures who are either doing something that's good or bad, and your motivations are either, good or bad, pushes people to extremes. It's part of the reason that people feel that they are lost and don't have a sense of belonging or a sense of community and aren't listened to. And it's the very thing that drives people to the extremes of participating in a TikTok industry like this. And that cycle goes round and round and round and round. So I think it's important that we stop and that we listen to each other.